So hello everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about how to stop players skipping the story in games. So the question isn't as simple as this, and that's a bit of a joke, silly way of phrasing it. But today I'm basically going to talk about some ways in which, or some simple pitfalls some people can find or face with their narrative games. Sometimes even in other types of games where you have like a brief amount of story and it doesn't work very well. So I'm just going to be scratching the surface of what this all is. If at any point I'm speaking like way too quickly for anyone, just like start waving at me crazily and I'll like slow down what I'm saying. There we go, it works. So yeah, first of all, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about me and what I've done so you can contextualize my advice. I started my road to getting into games with an academic type thing. Completing a PhD in identification and ethics in novels and video games. So for this, I looked at lots of different books, some films as well, and different games to think about how we build the sense of the characters we're interacting with, that we're controlling, that we're making choices in response to, and that's sort of what I started. So that was how I first started doing stuff related to games. A while later, I released my first solo project, which was a piece of interactive fiction called Paper Brexit, shortly before the referendum. It was anti-Brexit, just so people know, on my stance. And this was a kind of text-based narrative game with a slight visual element made using Inkle's ink, if any of you are familiar with that. Yeah, it was about 50 minutes long. No one else had done anything like it, and it ended up getting picked up on Rock, Paper, Shotgun, Kotaku, and a bunch of websites like that. So that was very helpful. So I didn't do it for that reason. It was kind of lucky in how it got picked up, but that was good stuff I could point to when I did other projects. I followed this up with a longer kind of anti-Trump game called Paper Trump, which is a bit more serious than it sounds. The name was terrible, so if I re-release it, I'm going to change the name because it makes it sound a bit sillier than it is. And that's a kind of longer 2 to 3 hour narrative about the US presidential election with more kind of graphical elements, more musical elements, higher production values. This then led to me getting hired as a bunch of game studios, this kind of collection of private work, to write games for them. So chief among them, Hello Games, who did No Man's Sky, Supermassive, who do Until Dawn, and a bunch of other studios as well that we can talk about later or whenever if you want. Go on my website. Just some of the projects I've been involved in, not all of them, but just some of them. No Man's Sky, so for this I wasn't involved in the original release. I joined with the second update. Originally hired for about 3 days, and then it was kind of extended after just a little bit of initial work, until I was there for quite a long time, and ended up writing the Pathfinder Atlas Rises updates and a little bit for the most recent multiplayer update next. And in this, we added a 30-hour storyline to the game, branching narrative, new UI, lots of different kind of features, and worked with the team to develop a new storyline that kind of augmented what was there and added to it in various ways. I also worked for THQ Nordic on Aquanox Deep Descent, which is a kind of new title in the series Aquanox, which is kind of a venerable series you can download on GOG and various places, kind of underwater vehicle combat, and that's still to be released later. Trailblazers, racing game. Dulac and Faye doesn't have the logo, that's a kind of Telltale style narrative game. Fort Triumph, it was a kind of XCOM style RTS. That doesn't have a logo, but that's Mad Devils, which is a kind of World War II Hellboy supernatural narrative shooting game. Cthulhu Chronicles I did recently. It hasn't come out yet, my episode, but I did a kind of Lovecraftian story about Wendigos, and every other choice in the game is like, do you eat something and you don't know what it is, and then you find out it's like people, and then it's all quite mysterious and horrific and horrible. I was quite sleep deprived when I wrote it as well, but I think this kind of adds to it because it's all kind of spooky. I worked on a game called Tau Station, which was an online MMO space game. And in the corner, a game called The Vortex, which is for Amazon Echo platforms, and is made by Doppio Games, who's also here at this conference. And it's being made in Portugal as well, so hence my connection to this, finding out about this. And in that game, you sort of work with a variety of robots to reclaim control of a ship that's floating derelict in space. So a lot of kind of space games on here as well, a lot of kind of dark content and some comedy as well. There are more games than that, just wouldn't all fit neatly on the slide. And you can go to my website to see more of them, and more to be announced as well. So I've written on quite a variety of games and types of games, and this is going to contextualize a lot of what I say, because you have to, when thinking about game narrative, you have to think about like what's appropriate for what you're doing and why you're doing it. So some of these teams, and I'm not going to say who on the questions or anything, every team cares about their game, and every team wants a great story for their game, or wants all the elements to be as good as they can be. But different games are very naturally invested in different storytelling to different degrees. So, you know, like a Telltale game, or like God of War, the most recent kind of big AAA cinematic game, they're very heavily invested in the story being good, because that is a large amount of the game that they're offering to people. Some other games don't have quite that investment because it's not as central part of the experience. So that leads to a variety of situations. And a lot of what I'm about to say is also linked to other writers and stories from the industry, so not everything is about myself. But there's kind of a lot of, I've had lots of very good experiences, and I've had a lot of difficult experiences where the teams were always lovely, everyone was very cared, but you, as a game writer, sometimes you get brought in like a few weeks before it's out, and you just have to madly finish it off, even if it's been in development for like 5 years. Or they have a story and they suddenly realize it's not very good and then want another one, and it's coming out in like 2 months or something. And sometimes you're brought in from the very beginning, sometimes you have months lead up, and it changes all the time. So this, spoilers, sorry. So this is a joke thing that's from the Game Writer group on Facebook, so I didn't make this, I don't know who made this, but this is a good kind of reference point for talking about game writing. So this was a joke thing about what different people think game writers do and what game storytelling is. The top one is a guy being attacked by a monkey, so what game designers think you do, so presumably like ruining their work, why are you on their back, why are you bothering them, they want to make a good game with good gameplay, why are you interfering? Game producers think you do, pulling a magic rabbit out of a hat because, you know, you're just going to somehow make this good, do it, please. What screenwriters and novelists think you do, you're like some kind of kid working on a story and you don't deserve any respect for them, you're just doing something silly. What you like to think you do, kind of being some kind of heroic general on a horse fixing the world. What you usually end up doing, kind of what Rhiannon Pratchett termed narrative paramedic, so arriving on a kind of crime scene to rescue someone from dying. And what gamers think you do, and this brings us to the topic of this talk, is press A to skip, so you do the stuff that you have to skip. Now this is obviously a bit of a generalization and is being done for comedic purposes, I would just hesitate to add. So we know most players don't actually want to skip all story. The success of games like God of War, Spider-Man recently, Spider-Man less story-based, but still, show that people are invested in single-player narrative experiences to various degrees. But there is this kind of cultural cliche of like, oh, people just want to get out of the story, they don't care about the story. And that's here for a reason, and I think it has, I mean, the TLDR of this talk will be just make a good game. So that's the kind of the secret to how to get people not to skip it, is to make it actually good. But there are various things to think about in this sense that are practical tips and hints and things I've learned and observed elsewhere that can increase the likelihood and account for this instinct in players not to engage the story. And this way of thinking about it, that you're trying to convince them to engage in a story rather than just accept that they have a story and you've got to do the story and you've got to do it, is a good way of thinking about this, because it just affects your approach. So how do you stop players skipping story in games, and why would you want to? So I haven't actually written any slide points about this, I'm just freestyling this kind of a bit, but why do you want to do this? So some of you in the audience, I was overhearing a few people earlier, they said they're working on a narrative game. Might be here because you love story and you want to make sure it's good and you just want to learn things. Some of you here, maybe here because there was no, like, you wanted to come to this talk because you didn't want to go to anything else or something. And some of you may be here because you're kind of curious about, like, this is a feature of a game and how do I make it good, even if it's not my main concern. So companies spend a bunch of money and effort on the story of a game. Even in mobile titles where you get a bit of text before and after a mission and it's not very much, there is still UI work, man hours, hiring a writer to do that, or just getting someone else in the company to do it. There's a lot of effort, kind of even for a game where it's not central, where you have spent money on that. That's a thing you've invested in. And that you should maximize the chances of that being good, even if your primary focus is like, at your studio is not narrative. If you're gonna have one, it should be like decent and appropriate for what you're doing. The reason why this is otherwise, one, you've just wasted money. Two, it's just going to not instill confidence in the rest of your game features. If you're playing a game and the story is not very good, it drags the whole thing down. At its best, a game narrative, even if it's not your focus and you haven't set out to make a game because you want to make a story, at its best, game narrative can provide contextualization and kind of an explanation for why you're doing what you're doing, and experiential factors that lift all other content and explain it. And even after you finish the story, if you're continuing to engage in gameplay, even if you're not conscious of it, the story and the reason for those stories and the emotions involved would linger in your mind. And that can be very powerful if done well and if geared well towards your game mechanics. So those are two primary reasons. Beyond that, we've learned a lot in recent years that a good narrative can build fan bases, it can build retention, it can do tons of things that a lot of people kind of don't think about in relation to their projects. So when I tweeted that I was going to do this talk, I got some responses just with jokes, or some guy was like, no, you haven't solved this, why are you trying to claim you've solved this? And there were various other people who said things, but I took 3 screenshots just because, partly it's a joke with the one on the left, but partly because I think they're indicative of some interesting ideas. So one on the left says you should, so when I said, oh, I'm going to talk about how to get people to stop skipping the story, how to get them to engage, one guy just said, make it unskippable. That's the solution. So they can't skip the story, they have to stare at it for a while. It has this kind of devil, kind of crafty character looking at that. Someone answered a bit more seriously in the top right. They said, some stories send you careening about, desperate for the next tiny insight, the deep and enthralling tale untold. And there are others that make you so very glad there's a next button to be spammed to get through it. So this idea of some, and there's some interesting words there as well, careening about, looking for the next tiny insight, enthralling tale. This idea of suspense, of being drawn forward, and also the idea of small, so the idea of tiny insight, like almost like a treasure trail or a hunt for something. And as a way of viewing narrative, that's an interesting kind of insight. At the bottom right, someone just suggested keep the text short, don't have too much on screen. So the idea of in 80 days by Inkle keeping text to about the length of a tweet. All these are not very bad insights, including actually the make it unskippable, but that's obviously not what we're going to do. So you have to think about why players skip story in the first place. And I'm going to go through some of these throughout the talk. Oh, cool, timing's going, okay, cool. And we're going to go into more detail on these and points. And some of you are probably already familiar with some of these, but hopefully this gives you some new insights. So some people skip the story or don't want to engage with story content that occurs in a game because there's too much information, too many words on the screen, the wrong kind of information in too much detail. I try not to badmouth specific games by name, just in case the company hires me one day, so then I haven't on record attacking them. But there was a game I think the company went bust anyway, but there's a game 10 years ago where it started with this kind of big cutscene explaining this fantasy universe, and it just described so much detail about how all the different things in this fantasy world worked that I just really didn't care. It was just boring. It hadn't given me a reason to care. I was being told to care about this because this information about this fantasy world might be useful for me at some point, not because there was any inherent interest. So it was just too much information, even in a cutscene. Second point, ludonarrative dissonance, which some of you may have heard of as a term. So ludonarrative dissonance means the idea of when ludo, so playing, and narrative, obviously story, don't work together. The gameplay and the story don't fit in some fundamental way. That can lead to non-engagement. A mishandled introduction to the beginning of a story. So the beginning of a game's narrative will have a kind of, with any narrative, has a disproportionate impact upon your engagement with that story and the way you relate to it than any other part of the story. This is kind of echoed in a lot of kind of social psychology, I think is the right discipline term, that the beginning of something, you have a far more kind of greater cognitive bias towards. So when if you go into college, university, so on, at the beginning, your first days there, you remember way more than some of the kind of middle periods, just because that's a big part of your memory formation. The ending of an experience also has a big impact, but as we know in games, a lot of people don't actually make it to the ending, so that's kind of less kind of crucial for the purposes of this talk. So we'll go into detail about that as well. A lack of engaging, intriguing, emotional resonance, conflict, and/or mystery. So you can't expect people to care just because there's a story. That's expecting someone to like someone else just because they're in front of them. We don't just make friends with anyone. We pick our friends. Something draws us towards them. Likewise here, you have to kind of give people a reason to get engaged. Now, that could be something emotional, because we all find emotional stuff interesting if it's done right. It could be some kind of conflict. It could be a mystery. So mystery is a kind of classic. So often when at the start of a police detective drama or another kind of show, you get a kind of central, like a murder's taken place, and that's the mystery that has to be solved throughout the thing. You're immediately, even if it's not done well, slightly curious as to what, who killed someone, if it's a mystery. And in this sense, games aren't so different, and you can view the storylines a similar way. The final reason, which is quite just fundamental and kind of ties into all the others, is if they're not there for the story and you haven't given them any reason to change their opinions. So if you're making like a kind of in-depth RPG game or a Telltale style game or a cinematic narrative game, it would be odd if someone was just skipping all the story non-stop because they've come to play a story-based game, so why would you skip everything? Now, some people do. I don't know what you can do with that group. Like, why did you buy that game if you're just going to not play that element of it? But with a lot of other games, and a lot of the games I've worked on, it's not the star of the show. There is a story there, but it's not, like, you can imagine a lot of people playing the game without caring about the story. So if that's the case, you have to give a reason for why people should change their mind, which just requires a different scale of thinking to if you're working in another medium. So this comes down to the real question of this talk, which is, if you don't care about the story element of your own game, why should players care? Now, this is a fundamental problem with a lot of levels of game development. So previous talk, great talk on indie and AAA games. I've encountered both in indie and in large-scale companies, people who know there should be a story, but they're not really invested in it, and they'll tell you so repeatedly, which is a bit odd, because that's your job. But then other times claim they do care and they want great reviews, but they don't really want to invest the time in it, and it can be, and this isn't necessarily a company, it can sometimes be individuals, because you can get that in any company, but how do you make people care about the story if your company or your studio or your designers at your studio or anywhere that isn't too invested in it? And this isn't even necessarily a huge failing. This can be because they're interested in other stuff. They're not story people. Why would they care? But you have to, if it's going to be an element of your game, you owe it to the game project as a whole, not to shove it to one side. And as that with that earlier slide, how people view game writers and narrative people, you can't do that because otherwise everything else you're going to do is going to be tarnished by the story. So, some practical little kind of things to think about as kind of quick band-aids for the problem. Hire writers or narrative designers early in the development process. Now, by this, I don't mean necessarily take on someone as a full-time member of staff who's there all the time. I mean, if you're going to get an outside writer, if you don't have someone on your team who can write already, then get them, even for just like a day or two or for a few hours, to look over your documents. Get them to comment at key stages on what's going on and involve them and let them have their opinions, because you can avoid so many problems and often get great extra ideas in other areas if you do that early as opposed to the last minute. Keep the narrative team, or if it's someone combining the role, just whoever it is, whoever's doing the story, in communication with other key development roles, especially art, sound, and UI. There are tons of times where you're writing a character and you suddenly get shown what they look like and you didn't even know they were designing what they look like, and you're like, okay, that's what they look like then, and then you maybe, like, sometimes that really doesn't fit with your visual kind of ideas of it that would fit in your mind with the narrative. You get a very aggressive, violent-looking character model when you wrote them as a bit just, like, peaceful. And you can often use that to your advantage, so a lot of being a kind of game writer hire is finding weird decisions and turning them into kind of polished, kind of cool uses of that idea. But it's just great to have that involvement and have everyone talking to each other in the team, because often, because story is either an afterthought or is something that's brought in like towards the end of a development cycle, you won't have this happening, and that explains why a lot of games either end up with bad stories or with very weird, strange stories. Finally, aim for a minimum viable prototype of some story text or placeholder voiceover implemented as soon as possible, even if it's still a really simple kind of implementation, and get every team member to play and give feedback. This forces everyone to view the story as something that's happening, gets them to take it into account in their development process. It will expose a bunch of design problems or programming problems or flow problems in the team's work that were not previously apparent. And it also gives the writer an opportunity to actually tweak what they're doing in relation to final implementation. So some games I've worked on, I do not know how good it's going to be until it comes out, which is terrifying, because I often boost them online, I'll go on about great, and I haven't had the opportunity to play them. And that's often with smaller titles sometimes, where indies have got me in very late, and often they've just been great anyway, so it's been great. But like, if you're able to actually play it, that's always very useful, obviously, as a writer. So for those of you who have power over studios, or who may one day have power over studios, or wherever you are in your career, like, be good to your writers and do this will help. So, some tips to get you started in a practical sense with your actual narrative implementation and how you write it and how you approach the game. So first of all, the idea of information overload. Keep text on screen minimal. Some UIs are very strange and they've got like huge amounts of text on screen or like text in different bits of the screen and it's all too much. If there's a large amount of dialogue to be communicated, break it up into kind of small bits of UI. So Zelda's a great example of it. You get this little box, there's not too much, you press a button, it continues. However, because you force the player to press a button to continue that dialogue, you should ideally not have too many boxes in a row, otherwise the player will just start skipping because they want to get to the end of it. So try not to have more than 3 dialogue boxes in a row if you do this, if it is done by this kind of UI. And just equate this to cutscenes as well. Don't have a giant cutscene every time you have a cutscene throughout a game. Like, it's not, like, people will get bored of that because they're not involved. Finally, and this is a bit more broad, take a sledgehammer to your script. Cut from your script. You do not need as many words in your game as are there. During development, be comfortable with a longer script, but then especially in playtesting, think about yourself when you're getting bored, when you're less invested in this, when is it going on for too long, and then alter the script accordingly or request your writer do so. Next, ludonarrative dissonance. So as I said earlier, ludonarrative dissonance is when storytelling mechanisms or the story style of a game do not fit in some fundamental way with gameplay mechanics. So first of all, ensure the style of writing is right for the game in question. If you are doing a mobile game with very cutesy kind of bears and kind of silly graphics, you could have some really dark, horrible, tragic murder story, which could be kind of funny in its own right, I guess. So you could do that on purpose for funny reasons. But like, try to think about what's right for the actual game. I think part of the problem as well is that some people in the industry have been burned by bad writers or writers from outside the industry. Who are maybe used to a different thing. So when you're hiring a writer, so when you're thinking about who to work with, try and work with someone who plays a lot of games, who's maybe worked on different types of games rather than just the genre you're working on, because they'll be more flexible about this and they won't try and write their weird true detective story in your like gacha game or whatever. Try and think about the central emotions evoked by your gameplay and then write a story about that emotion. So, for example, and 2 examples here. First one is actually a game worked on with the Portuguese team I mentioned, Doppio Games. So if you're going to make a voice-based game, like an Alexa voice-based game, which is what that game is, and it's entirely told through communication and sound, though there is a version where you can see more visuals. What do you do with that? So in that game, you are talking to people, they're doing things for you, and there are time delay involved in that. So make a story where the themes are about communication and people talking to each other. In this case, it's robots. But about the nature of communication, about being, and some element of physical isolation as well. Because if you're communicating with your voice, that's very physical and very embodied. It's very you, and you're very self-conscious of that compared to if it's a kind of typing game or a controller-based game. And you can play around with that in the tone of your story and what's going on in the event. If you have a game about exploring a new continent or a new place and going out into the world, make something about that sense of wonder. But also think about, and this is why I said write about the conflict, think about the underside of the positive experience you're trying to do. So if you have a game about finding new things, going new places, exploring, in what way could that be sad or a bad thing for someone involved in that scenario? So in this sense, you have a sense of wonder, of joy at seeing new things, but you've also, if you're moving on all the time, you don't have a home, you leave people behind, you're on your own if you're going to new places all the time, and that stuff you can play around with in the story. It's the kind of, I didn't write this on the slide, that would have been a cool term, but it's kind of like the thematic space of what you're doing in relation to your gameplay. So like what surrounds that emotion, what can you play around with? And that's why it's great to get the writer or whoever's working on the story playing the game, and just, if you're all playing the game, think about what emotions you feel, what could you feel when this is better than it is and it's closer to the end of development, what's aspirational for this game at its best, and then try and think about your story ideas in relation to that, rather than doing something totally different. Now, the idea of mishandled introductions. So, there was another game I played recently, which I'm obviously not going to name again, because I don't want to attack people. But it was, in this game, like the first choice you had was whether you were offered 2 items to hold. You're offered a chocolate bar and a torch. And the other person's got these 2 items. They say, which one do you want, the chocolate bar or the torch? And that was just very strange. Like, I don't know who's invested in that choice of a chocolate bar or a torch. Like, why do I care? I don't know what, like, I imagine the torch is probably going to be more useful, but maybe someone will want the chocolate bar. And it's just very strange. It's kind of a bit bungled. I think also, like, a problem with, I mean, it's kind of interesting from a flip side perspective. I mean, I guess it made me think about it enough to talk about it right now. So maybe it was actually genius, and I'm just not appreciating it. But, like, it's odd. And it doesn't, it's very gameplay process oriented in a way which doesn't necessarily get you to feel anything. It makes you think, you wonder why you're being offered it, you start making assumptions and judgments. So like when you meet someone in real life, things about the way they look, things about the way they sound, things about the things they say, that makes you have judgments about them. Those judgments might be wrong, and you might quickly learn that and revise your opinion of them, but you make a first impression. Narrative in a game and the characters you meet are very similar. You're going to make first impressions, not just about them, but about the game they're in. So give someone a reason to care about the story, and they're more likely to care about the game. Everything will work together. So why do people care about things and stories? They care about them because of emotion, of an idea of usefulness, and an idea of relevance. So emotion being we care if we're made to feel something, because in many ways that's circular, because feeling something is caring. It's the same thing. So if you can get someone to feel something, they're in. Usefulness. So if what you're hearing is somehow useful to you and you grasp that it's useful, you'll be engaged. The kinds of stories that particularly tie into usefulness are mysteries. So if there's a crime to be solved, a problem to be solved, something that's being withheld from you, and you think you've got little clues from it in what they're saying, you'll be paying attention like you would in, like, if anyone watches series like Making a Murderer on Netflix and kind of true crime dramas and stuff, you pay a lot of attention to what everyone's saying, in case it gives you some like idea of what's going on, of who killed the person, of your theories about things. So if you can tie that into the narrative, that's great. Now, just to stop people going too far with that, you're teasing people with it. You're not just giving them direct answers. You're almost, I mean, it's not on one of these slides either, but there was a great piece of acting advice I heard once for the theatre and film. If you've ever seen people in a film or a TV show pretending to be drunk and playing a drunk person who's had too much alcohol, they often do it very badly, and it's very obvious that they're doing it badly and they're not actually drunk. One theatre practitioner gave someone the advice that you should play someone who's pretending not to be drunk. So the actor should like pretend to be a drunk person who's pretending not to be drunk, who's pretending to be sober. That kind of tones down your performance, but in a way which is far more believable than overdoing it and obviously faking. If your narrative and your characters come across as inauthentic and like they're faking and that it's not real and your attention is drawn to the fact the story isn't real, people don't like that. They judge it as false, as something not worth engaging in, something they want to skip. It's distasteful. So that all helps her a lot. So ideally, and once again, this advice just sounds like write a good story, which is a bit simple, obviously. Try and be emotional and try and be intriguing. Try and get people invested. So one thing I often advise people on, so in some kind of, because I do a lot of mentoring for games writers, I do a lot of talks for early career people, some people send me their kind of short text-based games for feedback, and I look at them, and often the first choice is something like, often you have a huge amount of text, and that immediately I'm like, don't have a huge amount of text at the beginning. I'm reading this because I said I'd read it, not because I want to. And then the first choice is something like, go left or go right, so go into a different direction. That is like one of those boring choices you can offer anyone ever, at least at the beginning. I mean, I did actually write that choice recently in something, so like it's not, like, it was good where I did it, because it was a dramatic, suspenseful moment about 2/3 of the way into the story, and you'd been told something about what was in either direction, so it was a bit of a shorthand to go there. But it's not something without, I mean, there are always exceptions to everything I'm saying, so there's always a way in which someone can make this good, so I'm not saying that would never be good, but you're far better going out of the gate with choices or kind of opportunities to the player, if it's a choice-based game, or things happening on screen that provide some kind of opportunity for the player to be drawn in an unexpected way. So one thing I like doing in games often is a character being rude to you, or you having the opportunity to be rude or polite to someone. So if a game, especially a choice-based game, started with you're sitting in a restaurant or in a bar, and a waiter comes over to you and tells you that a guy across the room has bought you a drink. You could then like accept the drink or refuse the drink, maybe the choice is go up to him, stay where you are and try and ignore him. It immediately creates a kind of dramatic dynamic in that space where it raises question both of emotional and relevance. So, like, am I going to be polite or rude? Is this going to have some social consequence, what I'm doing right now? It also raises a kind of mystery in that, why is he giving you the drink? You immediately wonder that as a question. So you're drawn in immediately. You want to know what happens next. And you have to constantly convince people that they want to know what happens next. And that's the idea of the final bit, seduce your player into caring. So the idea of seduce or seduction is a kind of strange metaphor to use in this sense, because obviously it's about love and relationships and stuff. But in many ways, your game story as a whole is a relationship with the player. You have to want to engage with that. And it's one of the most optional relationships of a game, in that we can imagine, and we all do, play games that we don't really like the story, but the game's just really fun. So it's got this kind of nagging kind of X talking to us throughout the game who we don't really want to engage with and we just want to skip past. It's a necessary evil. If, however, it's a kind of loving relationship, a warm relationship for the passion and kind of you always want to know what's happening next, it's all very exciting, then you're on a journey together. You're doing the game to play together. It's not dissonant. So, however, even if you do all these things, like you do everything right, there will always be people who won't engage. This is either because they're there for the gameplay, like, oh man, sick, I just want to do some racing or whatever like that, or you have like people who just kind of don't enjoy reading it, it's a text game, or people who don't enjoy long cutscenes, or people who just like don't really have the time for that and just want to engage in a different element. How do you cope with that? What do you do? There are actual ways around this as well. And so this first suggestion of make it unskippable, if you take that literally, sounds ridiculous, but there's a way of drawing people into the story who don't want to be drawn into the story by accounting for it. So you make people who skip the story you make that part of the story, you make that a narrative decision. So one game series that does this quite well at various bits is the Demon's Souls, Dark Souls series. So in Demon's Souls, I think in the others, I can't remember though, you basically, when you're talking to an NPC and they're saying stuff to you, you can just walk away. In the gameplay, you can just walk away from them. And they'll often say something to you, like, where are you going? Or why are you being rude? Or kind of, they just get upset with you, like, why are you just walking away from them? And it's a great little moment because it makes it real. I mean, they are responding to your decision not to care about the narrative and not to engage in that fictional world has become part of the story without you even wanting it to. And it has an emotional social consequence in that people react like you're being rude. And often when people act like, there's a line in Game of Thrones where one of the prostitutes, one of the many prostitutes in that series, season 1, she tells Daenerys' brother a big emotional dramatic story about like the last dragons and how they died. And he starts crying. And then he gets a bit mopey anyway, he's a kind of soft person. And he says towards the end of the story, like, why are you telling me the story? And she starts like getting a bit defensive. And he says, what did I buy you for? To make me cry? Which is a very kind of character moment for him, because he's a really bad guy and he's being really horrible to her, and that's an awful thing to say. But in terms of the way in which people engage with characters in game in particular compared to other mediums is because games as software, games as apps, games are things that you use and that you buy to make you kind of have an enjoyable time. And so a lot of people make the mistake of making that, and this is sometimes a AAA thing as well, or mobile game thing, where you make the characters very safe, very putting you the center of the universe. You're the hero who's going to solve everything. Oh my God, I'm so delighted you're here. It's the hero of so-and-so is here. Praising you, being very nice to you, being very bland to you is the thing often NPCs do in games. They just kind of just say quest objectives. They don't really go into much more detail. Characters that are rude to you, characters that joke with you, characters that engage in slightly negative behavior to you, sometimes evoke that kind of weirded out reaction of what? Like, well, why is this character being horrible to me? What does my social behavior in this game have an actual consequence, even if I don't care about the narrative? It can be an incredibly weirdly investing thing, which sometimes grabs attention. So I was once watching a Let's Play of one of the games I worked on, which I try not to do too much because it's a bad idea to do. Someone skipped a bit of text they were going through because they just wanted to get to the next bit. And then the character sassed them out a bit about it in a similar way to what I was just describing. And the streamer suddenly stopped. And, the streamer suddenly stopped and was like remarked upon it and was like, oh wow, like, well, you know, F you, dude, kind of like getting upset with the character for doing it, and it grabbed his attention, and he clearly kind of was a bit more, it makes you curious about what other things the game will do, so it can be a great strategy to engage in. So we know people want great, engaging stories in games. The fallacy that game narrative is dead, that we're all going into big, emergent experiences is patently not true. Because we've seen tons of games like that fail, come out, be bland, no one cares about them. And God of War and Spider-Man over the last year, 2 big first-party narrative exclusives, have done like gangbusters in like what they've sold. So even if you don't care about the story artistry of your game and you just care about gameplay, even if you just want a kind of good product and you're investing money in it for that reason, it fits not only your game's objective, your player experience, but a financial objective to make this thing as good as it can be in an appropriate way. I just end with this kind of quote, which I quite like and I use various times. I think it's quite a cool quote from Series 1 of Westworld, not Series 2, because I didn't really like Series 2, I thought it was a bit rubbish. He talks about why people come to Westworld, this park, which is all a bit like a giant video game. And he says they're not looking for a story that tells them who they are. They already know who they are. They're here because they want a glimpse of who they could be. At its core, I mean, this is partly just a cool-sounding statement. I mean, you could just read loads into that if you wanted to, and regardless of what was intended. But at its root, this also is analogous to what I'm saying here, in that people don't want the same thing over and over again. They don't want something bland. They don't want something serviceable. They don't want something safe. They want something that surprises them and that makes them feel something, even if they didn't know they wanted that. And tying a bit into the last talk as well, the industry plays it far too safe in assuming that people want certain things when you can be bold enough in your characterization and in the possibilities of the medium to make them want something that they didn't know they want. And once again, that idea of drawing people into it gradually, teasing them, seducing them into it, is like key for figuring out how this would be done. All comes back to this. If you don't care about the story element of your own game, why should players care? And that's the kind of battle you have to solve. So that's the end of the talk. Those are my details.